and this is Pioneer Valley Life. I'm James Sullivan. We're here in the studios of Easthampton's eMedia in the Eastworks building. And today my guest is Tom Goldscheider. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you.
Yeah. I had to look at your website to find out more information from you. A good friend of mine recommended that you come on the show here because you really do know a lot about Pioneer life. You're a historian, especially in the Northampton area and the Florence area, and your association with it's the Ruggles Center. Is that correct?
The David Ruggles Center.
Yeah, yeah. And that has to do, that's in the, where the historical museum is in Northampton, or where is it?
No.
Oh, no, it's in Florence.
It's in Florence.
Yeah, right, yeah.
It's on Nonotuck Street.
Okay.
Close to Arts and Industry, which a lot of people are familiar with.
Yeah. Well, as I said before, I work in the radio station, and our studio is in the old school.
It's around the corner from there.
Yeah, right.
Yes.
Okay. It also says here you're a writer, a speaker, and an educator.
Okay.
But one interesting thing is that you're also a farrier.
That too.
Yeah. That's an interesting combination.
A little unusual.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's what pays the bills.
Right. So you have a lot of, I used to know a farrier who lives up in Buckland. Can't remember his name, but he had regular customers that he went around to all the time,
Yeah.
Had his truck with all the tools in the back and everything,
That's me.
Yeah, that's you, so you have mostly this area. Is this what you cover? How far out of Northampton do you go?
45 minutes. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's the way it is, yeah.
It's, no traffic.
Right, yeah.
It's exactly 45 minutes.
I see.
I'm never sitting in traffic.
Yeah. And how did you get into being a farrier?
My first wife is a horse trainer and riding instructor.
Okay, yeah.
And
so you kept it in the family?
Kept it in the family, yes. Well, it's not part of my original family of origin,
right.
but yeah.
But it also says that you were a carpenter on the Cape for a while.
I
framing.
was.
Yeah.
We initially moved to Dennis.
Yeah.
And lived there for 5 years. And I worked as a timber framer.
Yeah.
But I developed chemical sensitivity, and I could not be around, all the paints and thinners and sealants, and so I can be in horse manure all day and all night. It doesn't bother me in the least. I'm not allergic to anything in nature.
That's good.
I'm allergic to the 20th and 21st centuries.
Right.
Which is why I spend most of my time in the 18th and 19th centuries.
Yeah.
Including the trade that I work in, which the tools haven't changed in 200
I'll
years.
bet, yeah. Well, horses' hooves haven't changed, have
It's
they?
about as low tech as you can get.
Yeah.
But
then at some point, you attended UMass and the School Without Walls program.
Yeah, I went. I didn't go to college when most people go to college.
Yeah.
I went and worked in the trades.
Yeah.
But in my 40s, I decided to go back.
Yeah.
And I went to UMass and I got a bachelor's in the University Without Walls program. And some of my professors encouraged me to keep going.
Yeah.
And get a master's.
Good.
And that was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
That was like a kid in a candy shop. Sitting around those seminar tables talking about books.
Yeah,
I enjoyed that.
Yeah, I know. I have a couple degrees, and not to the level that you have, but there was 10 years between them, and later on, the second one, meant much more than the first one, because I had a lot of time behind me by the time I got around to the second one. But
any teacher or professor will tell you that the non-traditional students, the old folks, those are like nice people to have in your class because they actually want to be there.
Yeah.
And they're, more life experience.
Yeah.
I could relate to the professors more than I could to the other students in the class.
Right.
Yeah.
So was that your first interest in history, or were you always interested in history of some kind?
Well, I come from a family of intellectuals.
Okay.
So I was a little bit misplaced going into the trades in the first place.
Yeah.
And I've always been a reader and interested in history. And it was not a complete accident.
Right.
But yeah.
Yeah.
There are advantages to coming to it as an avocation.
Yeah.
You know, not having to, I don't know, I'm not really, I like being outside, I like being independent, and, you know, being a farrier gives me those things, and then I can do the history work that I really love to do.
Yeah.
And if somebody really starts to annoy me, I can say, "I'll see you later."
Right.
I don't need this.
Yeah, yeah.
So
the horses are much easier to get along with.
Much easier than people. Yeah.
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 Right.
I enjoy being around horses.
So, some of your projects that you've worked on, I know you worked on one in Deerfield. Was it about? No, not about Deerfield. But I get confused sometimes. But most of the projects that you've worked on, whether it be you did a radio program and you did a film, and they had to do more with Pioneer Valley history. Somewhat. Yeah. Oh, the Shays Rebellion, was that the one of them?
That was my master's thesis.
Okay.
Was developing a new interpretation of what happened during Shays Rebellion.
Yeah.
It's one of the least misunderstood chapters, and a very critical chapter in American history.
Yeah.
So what I've sort of developed a little bit of a niche for myself in the history world. I call myself a public historian,
Right.
which is not unique. There's lots of those. And a public historian is someone who does not compromise best practice as a historian. You know, you want to verify your sources, you want to do your research properly, you want to present it honestly and forthrightly, but at the same time you want to make it accessible to an audience outside of academia.
Right.
And what I've ended up doing is looking at complicated stories, complicated, complex pieces of history through the lens of local history. And I'm very fortunate in that Western Mass has a really interesting, deep, and nationally significant history. So the first thing I did was to look at Shays Rebellion, which took place in Western Mass. But then I focused it even more down to the town of Williamsburg. And I looked at 3 men who were imprisoned for debts that were owed in the year running up to the rebellion. And, you know, we could talk for half an hour about Shays Rebellion. I sort of toggle in between 3 different subjects. You know, one of them being Shays Rebellion. I guess just briefly, I focused on these 3 men, and then I was able, most of the studies had been quantitative, like looking at comparing all the different towns and how they behaved during the rebellion. And instead of that, I focused on the one town and really tried to reconstruct the lives of these 3 farmers in Williamsburg, and what did they do and why did they do it. And this is social history, because you're recreating the lives of people who are normally left out of history, because they did not write letters, they did not get letters, they did not write books, they did not have books written about them. You know, these are farmers.
Right.
So it's a little harder to recreate their lives and what they did, but they're not any less interesting or significant than the John Adams and the Samuel Adams and the people that we know a lot about.
Right. So how did you go about finding out about these farmers?
Well, one of my teachers at UMass, Professor Levy, he really taught me how to do this kind of research. And that was the project of the class. He said, find a list. And I went to the Forbes Library and I found a list from 1786 of prisoners for debt in the Northampton jail. And sort of built it out from there. So, and then I had a very fortuitous experience. The other thing that I like there's a few reasons why I like local history. You know, one, I've already said, is that it opens up, Western Mass history is amazing, and it opens up onto national topics in a really important, clear way. The other thing that's really nice about local history is that there's a community. There's people. You know, it's like, that's the Ruggles Center. I'm there because of the people. It's a great group of people that I work with there. And likewise with the Shays Rebellion, I ended up getting to know a man named Rolman Black, who was the unofficial town historian.
For Williamsburg.
For Williamsburg. And, you know, I drove up his ridiculous driveway in the wintertime, and he's like a larger than life figure in every way, and just a super guy. And, you know, I handed him the list of the men that I'm looking at. I said, well, I'm related to two of them. You know, it's like his family has been in town for centuries, and he had files on them. And,
wow.
And it was just so much fun, you know, just being able to recreate their lives. And then I extended it to look at the creditors that had them in prison. And so I was, you know, looking at a topic that had normally been looked at in fairly abstract terms, in terms of real relationships between real people, and trying to recreate what the circumstances were. And the results were surprising, you know.
You mean what you found out?
What I found, yeah. I mean, that's part of being a historian, is that you have to be, well, first of all, be prepared to be humiliated by the next batch of historians that are going to try to tear down what you've done. But also be prepared to find stuff that, you know, you weren't expecting, that may or may not support your thesis if you started out with one.
What, did you start out with a thesis then?
I guess I didn't really, but what was really surprising is that these men, who I assumed were, you know, in support of Shays Rebellion, did not muster out. They did not actually join the armed insurrections. The men from Williamsburg who did turn out were average age 20, and they came from the most well-to-do families in town. So, you know, what that really showed me is that the actual armed insurrection, which, you know, this was right in the wake of the Revolutionary War. Everybody had guns. All three men that I looked at all fought at the Battle of Bennington and the Battle of Saratoga. And one of them had mustered out and gone out to Concord. In, you know, at the very beginning. But they would show up and close the courthouse in large numbers, but a shot was never fired. It was very well controlled. It was, but they, even though they supported it in spirit, they left. It was political theater that had gotten out of control. And what I found, what I thought, that what was really important was what the opposition itself stood for, outside of what everybody thinks of as Shays Rebellion, which is the failed storming of the arsenal in Springfield, and, you know, Daniel Shays himself. It was much bigger than that, and it was very important. You know, because the Shays Rebellion ended up precipitating the Constitutional Convention. And so what were the issues at play there? And yeah. It's complicated. I sort of toggled in between three different pieces of history. You know, Shays Rebellion is one. And then I got into the labor unions. In Greenfield.
In Greenfield, the Tap and Die.
At the Tap and Die. And that's what that was my next project. And then I have the the David Ruggles Center history. So there's sort of three pieces of history that I toggle back and forth, and my 64-year-old brain doesn't pivot on a dime anymore. You know? It's like, if I want to talk about Shays Rebellion, I need to sit quietly and steep my brain like a tea bag in Shays Rebellion for about half an hour, and then I'm ready to go.
Then you can have a conversation.
Yeah. So but that's sort of a little bit on the back burner. I haven't done anything with that.
Yeah.
But after I did that, I got involved with the union story.
Yeah.
And that happened on the picket line at the Franklin Medical Center, the hospital.
Yeah.
Up there. Where my wife is a nurse.
Yeah.
And she's very involved in the nurses' union, and the nurses went on strike.
Right.
And I
remember that. Yeah.
Walking the picket line in support of the strike, and I met a machinist who was telling me about things that had happened with labor unions in Greenfield at the Tap and Die, going back to the 50s and the 40s. And that's what got me started on that. And there, again, it's a local story that had bigger significance, and it was social history, and it was, in this case, also completely forgotten history. Nobody in Greenfield knew this story.
Yeah.
Even though it's a remarkable thing that happened there in the early 1950s.
That's what it was. Yeah, it wasn't that long ago. Oh.
Not that long ago.
Yeah, there's still people around
in your lifetime
who remember it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I got a grant. I've gotten 3 grants for Mass Humanities. That's one of the advantages of getting a master's degree, is it helps you get grants to do research. And again, I created a relationship with a man named Jim Terrapane, who runs the Museum of Our Industrial Heritage in Greenfield. And I strongly recommend that you visit. It's a great museum.
Yeah, I actually haven't heard of it.
Yeah, well, they're kind of like the Ruggles Center. You know, it's a small museum.
Yeah.
But he focuses on the industrial history of Franklin County.
Yeah.
And he has an archive. And then I also met these 2 retired union organizers at the picket line, and they brought me to the UE. The name of the union is the UE, the United Electrical Workers Union. UE Local 274 in Greenfield. And he took me to their offices and just left me there above the ice cream shop where they make ice cream.
Yeah.
And that was just amazing. It was every historian's dream.
Yeah.
You know, in a dusty closet in the way back, they had the old carbon copied, what's called onion skin paper, you know, of all of the original meeting records of the local from the going back to the 1940s, all in, you know, perfectly good, legible condition. And and they also created scrapbooks of newspaper clippings from the Greenfield Recorder, which was a decent paper back then.
Right. Yeah.
And well, it still is. And you know, between those things and then the archives that Jim had at the museum, you know, I was able to really recreate this this saga that took place in Greenfield.
That must have been amazing to come across all of that stuff.
It's
from
pretty
your
exciting.
perspective.
I mean, because you hear their voices.
Yeah.
You know, and it's all like hand typed, but their voices come through in their words. And people, I mean, you're probably old enough to remember, but like people had a pretty fun, different way of expressing themselves, like back in the 40s and the 50s, you know, especially like a working class.
Yeah, oh, exactly.
It's like very straightforward, very like dry humor, and no nonsense.
Right.
So yeah, it was the language is really makes it fun. Also with the Ruggles Center, there's a lot of, you know, really great writers that really makes it come alive. You know, you're not just looking at words on the page.
Right.
You can hear their voices.
That's great. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great experience.
It is. And then so I did that project, and I for both of those projects I developed talks.
Yeah. Public talks.
Public talks.
Yeah.
PowerPoint.
Yeah.
You know, I have images.
Yeah.
About an hour and 20 minutes I try to cap it at, because people get really fidgety after an hour.
Yeah.
And those are great.
Yeah.
I gave those at, you know, in a number of states. You know, I went up to Vermont, I went to New York, mostly in Massachusetts.
Yeah.
But then I sort of put that project to bed. I said, you know, that's run its course. But in the meantime, my younger son has become a podcast and radio producer based in Boston. And he approached me and said, let's turn this into a show.
Yeah.
And, you know, my son is kind of a big wheel in that world. He won a Peabody Award last year.
That's great. Yeah.
And now he's working for GBH. He's got like award-winning work that he does. So for him to, you know, tap his old man on the shoulder and it's like, sure. And, you know, he's just a pleasure to work with. You know, he's just like.
So is it his podcast, and then he invites you on as a guest?
We
or is it something you do
co-produced
together? You do together.
We co-produced it. Initially, we applied for an NEH grant.
Yeah.
And we had a really strong application, and we didn't get it. It's very competitive.
Yeah.
But afterwards, somebody I know who's gotten something like 10 NEH grants in the course of his career, he said, oh, I forgot to tell you, the NEH doesn't fund labor history. Never has, never will. So, okay.
Yeah.
So we didn't get that, and I thought, all right. And then Ian is my son. He said, well, let's scale it down and apply for a smaller grant and make, instead of doing an 8-part podcast series, which we had originally hoped to do, we scaled it down to a 1-hour radio special. And so we went back to Mass Humanities, and they funded it. Producing radio, I don't know about television, but film is very expensive.
Yeah, yeah.
Doing these podcast series is pretty cheap.
It is, yeah, yeah.
It's like he owns all the equipment, he owns all the software, he does all the mixing and the post-production work, you know, at home in his studio. So it's basically our time.
Right. You know, podcasts are huge these days. Huge.
Yeah. Well, he did one on the Big Dig. That's the one he got the Peabody for.
Okay.
And now he's got one in the podcast world on the Mass State Lottery. Which is very interesting.
Yeah.
But then he did this show with me, and NEPM co-sponsored it, and Jim Terrapane from the Museum of Our Industrial Heritage, he co-sponsored it.
Yeah.
So that was a whole another experience for me, turning it into a script. It was a little challenging because it's really a bigger story that I had to winnow down to 58 minutes or 55 minutes. But if people want to listen to it, it's nepm.org /Swords Point.
Swords Point, yeah.
And I have a website there.
Yeah, great.
And you can just click and listen to the show. It's 55 minutes, and it's an interesting story. If you're interested in Greenfield, if you're interested in labor unions, if you're interested in democracy.
Right, right.
All of those things.
Yeah. One of the things you mentioned in here is that you're interested in social justice.
Yeah, yeah. That was sort of ingrained into me at an early age.
Yeah.
It's hard to shake that loose.
Right. So then the Ruggles Center
Yes.
is, like you say, you're there in a variety of roles. So do you give talks there? You lead tours? I know I looked on the website, it shows a group of kids around the Sojourner Truth statue there, you know. So I guess that would be popular with school kids, school-age kids.
Yes. Well, that's my third Mass Humanities grant. I don't mind giving them a plug. They've been great to me.
Yeah.
Was to create a curriculum.
I see, yeah.
Which is what I'm holding in my hand.
Yeah.
I'm so used to doing radio.
Right.
I did quite a few radio interviews, but never television. Yeah, so I am the education coordinator, which is my official title, at the Ruggles Center. We're all volunteers. We're a nonprofit. We're a very small operation on a shoestring budget, basically. But we have great history. We have a great building. And we have a great small group of volunteers.
Yeah.
And we begin our meetings on time, we end our meetings on time. We don't get on each other's nerves. And so it's been a good ride.
Yeah.
And
so how did the Ruggles Center come about?
Okay. Well, we really have a founder. He doesn't like it when we talk about him that way, but there was a man, he still is, Steve Strymer. The story as I heard it, just in the paper today, he works at Collective Copies.
Oh, really? Yeah, they're moving to Florence.
They're moving to Florence.
Yeah.
That's in today's paper, which was news to me. I didn't know that.
Uh-huh.
They've always been in Florence, but they're moving their entire operation to Florence. So he's a printer and, has worked with Collective Copies for a number of years, and then they opened up a shop in Florence. And he was an art major in college, not a trained historian, but has a deep, interest in history. And he came to find out about early Florence history after opening the shop there. And then he found out a little more, and he found out that there was this utopian community in Florence in the 1840s that was run as a worker-owned cooperative. Collective Copies is a worker-owned cooperative. So that's what really got him hooked. And then he started digging deeper and deeper into that history. And again, like the story that I uncovered in Greenfield, except on a bigger scale, really, this history was completely forgotten. I take out walking tours with people my age who grew up in Florence and went to elementary, middle, and high school in Florence and Northampton and lived there their whole lives, and they had no idea that Sojourner Truth had lived in their town or that there was this, very important abolitionist history in Florence in the 1840s and 50s. So I really give him a lot of credit for starting that. It was an offshoot of the Sojourner Truth statue project. He and others were involved, Lisa Baskin, a lot of people who were involved in the creation of our museum were initially involved in the building the statue.
I see,
for Sojourner in Florence. And then they found out that this house on Nonotuck Street was going to be demolished, and they got a stay to keep it from being demolished, and they wanted to preserve it, and then they wanted to turn it into a museum. And this all happened before I came on board. So they created the David Ruggles Center in this house, which is right across the street from where the Utopian community was centered, in what they called their factory boarding house.
Right. Okay.
This group of ardent Garrisonian radical abolitionists got together and bought a state-of-the-art silk-making factory in this really sparsely populated section of Northampton, together with almost 400 acres of land planted in mulberry trees, which is what, the only thing that silkworms will eat are freshly picked, finely chopped mulberry leaves. And other businesses, machine shop, a lumber mill, and outbuildings, and they bought this whole thing for really pennies on the dollar. This was in the wake of America's first great economic depression, the Panic of '37. So I don't know where I'm going with this. It's such a big story. I always, it's like, where do I go next?
I know, No, I know, that's, as you said, you talked to my friend.
So he discovered that, and not only him, and then they managed to save the building, turn it into a museum. They dated the building through a process called dendrochronology. So the building was built in 1848. So it was standing when David Ruggles was living in Florence.
That's what I was going to ask you. Who is David Ruggles?
Who is David Ruggles? Well, that's a big portion of our mission as a museum, is to answer that question and to bring his name more to the fore. And I give Steve and the others who are there before me a lot of credit for having the foresight to name our museum that way.
I see,
So, who is David Ruggles? How many minutes do we have?
Well, we've only got a couple. So
So I developed a talk that I gave at the African American Burial Ground National Monument last year about David Ruggles' work in New York City, which is where he was primarily based. And that was great because I was giving the talk in the place where the history happened, in Lower Manhattan. And we have an exhibit at our museum about his work in New York City in the 1830s. And he, a thumbnail sketch of David Ruggles, he is one of the most important unsung heroes of the movement to abolish slavery and establish full rights of citizenship for African Americans. He owned and operated the first black-owned bookstore, reading room, printing press. He started the first black-owned magazine, and he led what was called the Committee of Vigilance, which was a self-protection. The black community in New York City was under siege from slave catchers who were kidnapping both self-emancipated enslaved people as well as freeborn blacks, as well as freeborn black children who were disappearing off the streets. So he founded it in his living room and then led it. He essentially was the Committee of Vigilance. And that Committee of Vigilance model was then replicated in Philadelphia, Boston, and countless other cities across the North. And they called him a one-man army. He developed what was called the Ruggles style. He was very brash, very bold, no fear in confronting authority. Contrary to what you might think, New York City was a pro-slavery city.
Yeah, I've heard, stuff about that people aren't really aware of, how pervasive slavery might have been in the North.
In the North, yeah. Eric Foner, who is arguably the most important living American historian today, named him the founder of the Underground Railroad.
Wow.
He assisted over 600 self-emancipated people coming up from the South in his apartment off of Broadway, and gave them shelter, safety, and then most importantly gave them letters of introduction to safe houses in New England and in upstate New York for them to go north, which is really, in a lot of ways, the genesis of what they call the Network to Freedom. And the David Ruggles Center is part of the National Park Service Network to Freedom. We're the only site really in western Massachusetts, in this part of New England.
Yeah. So it sounds like a place that everybody should go to.
It's an interesting history. There's lots of layers to it. David Ruggles is a very compelling figure. Of course, we also have Sojourner Truth, who is kind of our rock star, and everybody's heard of her, but almost nobody really knows anything about her.
Right.
And she lived in Florence for 14 years. David Ruggles also came to Florence and became a member of the Utopian community, as did Sojourner. And she had a very important evolution in her life, in her development, living in the community in Florence. She was exposed there to really the top echelons of the abolitionist movement. William Lloyd Garrison was the brother-in-law of one of the principal founders of the community in Florence. And they were really more like brothers, because William Lloyd Garrison came from a very dysfunctional family. And he married into the Benson family, and they really took him in. And Garrison spent a whole summer in Florence at the community. He sent his children to be educated at the school that was run by the community. And then he took the water cure with Dr. Ruggles. Because David Ruggles, after this very important work that he did in New York City, his health declined and he had to leave. And he went to Boston, and William Lloyd Garrison threw a party for him, a fundraising party, to help, give him enough money. But I mean, this is a longer story, and we're running out of time.
Yeah, I think we'll just have to cut it for here. But I mean,
so anyways, we have a lot of interesting. We have three kind of. The third one, I should just say her name. Is Lydia Mariah Child, and this is also just a mind-blowing story, and just and she's a great writer. She's one of America's great writers, and she was very well known in her day, but has since, now most people have not heard of her. So that's a big part of what we do, and I developed this curriculum. To it's an interactive curriculum.
I see. Yeah, great.
Which means that, typically for when school groups would come, they'd get off the bus. They were not terribly well prepared. I would have to give them the whole context and the whole background and what's an abolitionist and what's slavery, and I'm not faulting teachers here. It's just the way it was, and it would probably take them at least a half an hour to get their feet on the ground and even realize where they were. Right. And then they would follow me around the village, like goslings, essentially, and I would do all the talking. All the talking. Which is fine. It's like it was great, and a lot of the kids learned a lot. you know, we're fortunate in that a lot of the houses of the former community members are still standing within walking distance of the Ruggles Center.
Yeah.
And we had the cemetery where a number of them are buried, and so that makes for a great walking tour.
Right.
What I did with this is that I turned the tables, and I give the students the same primary sources that we use.
Mm-hmm.
And it's excerpted, and they have guiding questions to help guide them to the pieces of information that they need to extract from those documents. So it's scaffolded. They are the historians. They are doing original primary source research with some assistance.
Yeah.
And it's focused. And then they get into small groups in school, in class, with their teachers. And I've broken this down into 12 individuals that are connected with this history. And then each of these small groups will be assigned one of those 12 individuals with the primary source documents associated with them. And then they develop their own spoken presentations. And then they get off the bus, and they're the historians, and they lead their own walking tour.
Great.
And I just stand there and say, that's great.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
And it's much, the students really take away more from that.
Yeah.
So I'm really pleased with the way that's worked out.
Great. Well, we've certainly learned a lot here today. You know, as you say, we probably could have gone on for another, who knows how long.
Well,
because
Tom Rini and Bob and Barbara were there for 4 hours, and they're like,
we don't have quite that much time.
No.
But you know, it was worthwhile going over a little bit today because you know, it really tells a story, and that's what I want to do with Pioneer Valley Life, is to tell a story that's relative to life here in the Pioneer Valley, and this is very relative, going back a long ways. And it's something, like you say, people might not be aware of it, but they should. So, you know, who knows, maybe sometime we'll bring you back here and have an audience, and you can give a presentation here someday, maybe.
I'd be glad to. I have my note cards, my slides. I'm ready to go.
Okay, this has been Pioneer Valley Life. My guest has been Tom Goldscheider. Let's see, he says he is a public historian.
That's right.
So and a farrier.
And a farrier.
So thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you again next time.